Today we're going to be going over the March 24 top ops dissected. So as I tweeted, I felt March was a pretty active month, but overall I think the quality of ops slowed, just coming off of a very, very high level. So still pretty opportunistic, but just compared to how crazy January and February were a little bit tougher. I think the single best play of the month was NVIDIA, which we will get into in detail. And I think overall Reddit was also a pretty great ticker for the most part. So nevertheless, let's dive into some of these. SMCI on March 1st, and this came out after hours. And so this is just an important thing to touch on. So various indices have rebalances and add deletes, and a lot of these announcements come at certain times, so you can look these things up. So with the S&P, they have possible add deletes. I believe it is the first of every month, and generally these get announced at 5:15 p.m. Eastern time on their website. So a lot of people will scrape that site or look there for those announcements. What happened essentially was SMCI was a potential ad for a few reasons. It was more likely to be Palantir, or I think also possibly was it Snapchat? I don't really remember. But what you can do is, knowing that this ad delete is the first day of the month for that next quarter or whatever, you can then pay attention and say like, okay, 5:15, I'm going to stick around. And sure enough, to kind of probably some people's surprise, just based on like the criteria set out for these ad deletes, SMCI ended up getting added, and sure enough, this ended up going up a huge amount. And so here's the thing to keep in mind. Most times when these additions occur, you can actually track this data of how far these move. So there's S&P 400, 500, 600. Generally, the smaller things, like if you're doing like a 600 versus 500, those will be going up more. And generally, a 500 addition only goes up a couple percent. So you might be wondering like, oh, what makes this potentially so good? It's because this is not a normal stock, and this is not a normal context of the market. Like, as far as how in play this thing is, this is one of the most in play tickers we've seen in a couple years. So when this gets added to the S&P, it's not a matter of, oh, this is just going to go the traditional couple percent. This has the potential to really just rocket like everything else. What happens is this gets added at 5:15. It then sits around for a little while and doesn't go that far, but pretty much I know I normally do prior bar breaks, but if it hasn't really gone anywhere, I'm not going to be selling that. And especially if I have a view on how far this thing could go, you really want to take that. So I don't know what the perfect stop would be, but what I would say is there are definitely times where I want to be buying this, and especially if it's anywhere within 1%, I really just want to be long this stock and really not heading out. That being said, like, I think it's totally reasonable to be taking some sales into 940, 950, or especially when we spike into 980. However, once we consolidate and then set up and curl the highs, that 990 break is again a beautiful entry. Again, for those same reasons, I don't think you necessarily need to take the prior bar lows there if it hasn't really gone far from the 990 breakout. Those are some of the nuances. I'm not saying I necessarily would have held all the way to 1040 or anything, but those are the things to think about. But what I would say is, given how in play this stock is, when this is kind of just sitting there those first 10 minutes, that is just such a huge, massive opportunity, because these things always go more than 1% anyways. So really, this is a non-traditional play that we haven't really seen yet, but it's something I wanted to bring up for those reasons. And if there's any questions on this, we can touch on this more, but I highly recommend everyone start to collect the data on these ad deletes and when the rebalances are and everything else as far as the announcements. That could all be interesting for you. So let's dive into Bitcoin. This wasn't really that crazy of a play, but I think it's kind of just a nice little single to discuss. So Bitcoin was close to breaking 70K. We break it by a hair and then we crack. And this kind of just creates this multi-rollover play that then proceeds to snowball. And so one concept that's important to keep in mind is that the more legs you make in one direction, the better the expected value is going in the other direction. Meaning that after the third leg is generally better than the second, the fourth better than the third, the fifth better than the fourth, and so on, because the probability of a bounce increases, the risk decreases, and the reward increases. So all those lead to significantly improved expected values. So what ends up happening is, after many legs, we're chilling by 63,000. Then we make the sharpest and the highest volume leg since 70K. And that's the type of thing where I wouldn't mind buying a little bit into that move. You need to be a little bit careful with Bitcoin, just because sometimes this can make some really big moves. But But at the same time, I think like some of the old school, and this came up with my buddy Crypto Goose, where he was a little hesitant just because sometimes Bitcoin can really flush. And while that's true, I think as this gets wider and wider adoption, we're actually going to see some of those crazy 15, 20, 30% moves just dissipate as there's so much more liquidity in this. So I wouldn't have minded starting to buy into the 60,000 flush, but once that turns and breaks prior bar highs, I still think that's acceptable ad given how many legs this has done. Then using prior bar lows as the trailing stop. I don't think this play was that crazy, but I do think it was a nice little single. Now for what I view to be the biggest play of the month, and that would be Nvidia on what I would call an exhaustion-esque. So it's really worth considering the context of this, where we had broken out from 500 a couple months ago. And this is the biggest market cap stock there is right now, at least in the US and public markets. Maybe private as well. I don't know what Aramco's at these days. But anywho, we break out of 500 and this stock essentially doubles in the course of 2 months, which is crazy. So what's so interesting is we've already made a big move from 5 to 750. We start to go down, but then boom, earnings sends us back up. We break out and we do a mini leg, but then we start to go up. And what's so interesting is the day before the exhaustion gap, we were up on a Nomura upgrade where despite it being an upgrade, the analyst was essentially bearish in the sense that he's like, we're seeing extreme euphoria in these names. Every single day, the stock goes up 3-4%. A lot of this shows signs of near-term capitulation. I do think eventually this goes higher, but right now we're euphoric. Even though it was kind of a bearish analyst note, we still went up, closed strong. And sure enough, the next day we really gapped even more. So this day happened to coincide again on a Friday. And again, as I've stated for a couple months now, it's my strong belief that the options market is really driving a lot of these moves. And we're even going to see that later in MSTR and I would argue even gold this past week, even though this is being recorded in April, had a similar type move. It's worth noting that like we break out from, call it, I don't know, 825-ish. The stock then just goes so far. We've almost got another 20% or so in a matter of days. And we then have a very big gap. And now let's jump to the intraday. What happens is we're trading kind of range bound. And I don't think there's anything wrong with buying that 960 break as a potential quick long, but you need to keep in mind the big picture. This is a very dangerous long that I don't want to be holding, but I always listen to the chart. The intraday chart's the most important if you're an intraday trader. So there's nothing wrong with that 860 buy, or sorry, that 960 buy. And so then interestingly, what ends up happening is Bitcoin that cracks 70,000 and then totally flushes out. And it's my belief that risk off move is what then triggers the fail in Nvidia. This ended up happening on a Friday. And anytime I think in this market, as long as this remains true and is the pattern, you need to be thinking about those zero DTEs and how far these goes. And so actually what I ended up doing was even off the open when this was kind of trudging higher, I bought some of those 925 DTE puts, just thinking, not for any meaningful size, just like a couple grand worth, but just thinking that like, hey, you know, if this cracks, this is pretty capitulatory at this point, whatever. I was pretty busy that day, so I didn't have like a ton of time to keep my eyes on it. So I'm like, okay, let me buy a little bit of size. I think the way to play this is once this breaks the opening range lows, call it 947-ish, that's where you really want to probably just go for your stab and be in it to win it. Again, for similar reasons, with prior bar highs on taking any profit, you want to make sure that it's actually going somewhere. So I don't have any perfect system for catching this necessarily, catching the whole move, but I think with some of these zero DTEs, you just want to have a little bit of imagination because some of these can just pay out so big. What I would say though is once this really did kind of that bigger leg with the highest volume down to 880, I ended up flipping long there for a just kind of right side of the V play. Then at that point, it was kind of no man's land-ish to me. I don't think I mind that 880 break at 1 p.m. I don't love the amount of consolidation it's had though. I really wish there was another couple hours of consolidation. I think if we had another couple hours of consolidation until maybe 2 or 2:30, that 80-80 break probably would have been better. But it's so important to have imagination when this daily chart is so run up. We saw this with SMCI, we've seen this with others. Again, the big notes to keep in mind is think about zero DTEs and also think about the importance of when that opening range breaks. I know we discussed this on the last AMA, so I won't kind of go super nuts into this, but if there's any questions, please let me know. Now I'll discuss Fisker. This came out after hours and they essentially announced that they were exploring bankruptcy. This is kind of like the play we've seen so many times. We've seen so many of these offerings, bankruptcy announcements, whatever. We even had one last month, so this is another one. Simply short as soon as you can see the headline, prior bar highs, trailing stop, and that ends up being a super easy, nice layup. Again, I don't think these are any home runs. The whole point of these top ops is I'm really trying to show you all a variety of different plays. Some of these are home runs, some of these are just simple singles, easy money trades for you all to consider adding. I don't think I need to go into much detail, just want to highlight that. So now SOUN. First, let's start with this daily chart. This chart is coming from $2. It really started to get going when Nvidia, it came out that Nvidia owns a stake in this, which was already known. Super nonsensical that this is what caused the stock to explode, but hey, that's the market we're in. What ends up happening is in mid-March, we end up breaking above $8. That, for starters, that's something I definitely consider being long. And what happens though is the next day, this ends up flushing lower. Paradoxically, I actually like on this intraday when this flushes lower as a long. And so one thing to keep in mind is just kind of how on this daily chart, we kind of align in that uptrend with where this ends up stopping. And it's not really that euphoric, at least near term, where we did kind of just consolidate and then break out. Not that it's so great of a pattern, but now onto the intraday. So what ends up happening is this stock makes a little opening drive, we fail, then we go lower and break to lows. I don't hate the short, but I don't love the short either at $9. It kind of seems a little bit of a chase when we were just at 10.20, but you're probably not going to get in too much trouble doing it. But what I do really like is we then flush out on really, really high volume to 755. This is where I'd probably consider buying intrabar some. I don't want to go totally nuts just because of this stock being as run up as it is, but I do think it's worth considering an intrabar buy on the turn once this kind of turns on the box and everything. Then you just put your stop at lows, because this is a really, really big move. Essentially, this stock almost fell 30% in the course of 15 minutes, even though it really wasn't that run up, at least near term, those prior weeks. So I think this is just a little interesting play to think about. Again, nothing crazy. Now we're going to jump to Nova on the same day. So what was awesome is I think Neil and some of you guys caught this, which is totally great. Nova was just a weak stock on the daily, and we kind of formed this bouncy ball setup. So this is really not even a stock I probably would have been watching. So I think like it's totally normal to just miss that play. But then what happens is this does capitulate lower. This is just a beautiful weak leg. So if you short that break to lows, you can totally catch the whole leg short. Then on break of prior bar highs, right side of the V, you can flip long. And it's more often than you would think that you're able to catch plays like that. Really, I think the most common one to catch is just you see this selling off, making a big move, you're able to catch the long, using prior bar lows as the stop. But just wanted to highlight this. And there are softwares, again, it's been discussed many places where you can start to screen for this. Very important to do so. So now let's jump to the Reddit IPO. This is probably going to be maybe the hottest IPO of the year. Certainly, I would think a top 5 hottest IPO. And the best part is this obviously has meme stock potential. So the way I like to trade IPOs is a lot is based on the box. You do want to generally be long biased with these. So as we discussed with ARM back during that video, it is so common for these to make an opening drive that can hold prior bar lows. So right off the open, we find some support, we hold some bids. This is where I want to potentially buy the print, especially depending on how the box looks like. If we have some really nice bids, I will 100% buy that bid. I will definitely be adding, even on the box, when we were pressing up against $50, that's the type of thing where all 100% have a buy stop order to add above $50. Then as this gets going, I really just want to trust in that trend, and prior bar lows works perfectly here. Again, we saw this type thing in ARM. We've seen this in many IPOs before. If you've not done the homework, please go back and document all the hot IPOs. Again, this does not apply to normal, everyday, shitty IPOs. The hottest IPOs you really want to do this study for. Look at what Twitter has done. Look at what Airbnb, look at what Alibaba, all of those hot ones are really worth studying. I don't mind shorting that break of prior bar highs. You do end up being wicked out, but I don't think it's the worst idea, but I don't love it. In general, the best play was probably that long. And then we kind of just, nowhere else do we set up so entice me that I'd really want to have done much after that. And that's totally fine. So that's Reddit on its IPO day. Now, the other thing that I thought was interesting was Reddit on 3-25 when the options get listed. And so this is the type of thing where because of meme mania and the market we're in, you really got to be a little open-minded. This stock, sure enough, off the open, it does start to break higher. We do then consolidate at 52. And as we start to show strength, I do think it's totally reasonable to consider buying some YOLO options. There's nowhere intraday that's set up so amazing, in my opinion. But I do think you can kind of consider some of these curls worth buying, especially later in the day, like close to the close. I think you end up getting a lot of momentum traders that are going to be interested in overnighting this. So I don't really mind a break above 56. The other thing is this closing strong. I think you really need to be open to the overnight on this, or even when this is breaking out at around 330 and you get some massive volume coming in. I mean, look at that volume at 330. I do think it's worth considering some overnight long calls. This ended up gapping and running quite a bit the next day. I don't think this was so amazing anywhere intraday, but I do think it's just worth talking about the big picture, and again using options for some of this stuff and the thought of just momentum overnights in these IPOs. So here's the chart of the next day. No price action I super loved. Overall, it kind of stayed range bound, but this day was pretty euphoric, where if we did break the opening range, like if we broke below 63 later in the day, I probably would have considered a short, and if we held there, holding that short overnight, as this was quite a big move to go from 45 to 75 in 2 days. And that, I think, is then what can begin to structure a bigger picture swing short for some of you swing traders. Again, nothing so crazy here, but just thought worth discussing to give people different viewpoints and perspective. MSTR on March 28th. I actually think this is probably one of the most important plays to discuss. And so what happens is Kerrisdale comes out short pre-market, I believe it was. Obviously, we know this stock is super run up. We know it is trading at a huge premium to the value of its Bitcoin. Everybody knows all that. So when this short initially came out, I think myself, like everyone was like, well, duh, everybody knows about this. BFD, big deal. What we end up finding though is that I don't want to be too biased, and like I don't want to be too biased either way. Ultimately, I just want to trade the stock, but I don't have any strong conviction that this is actually going to go down initially, just because look, everybody kind of knows about this. So what does happen though is we do end up cracking off the open, and so this happened on a Friday as well. And so actually, thanks to some pod members of mine, they actually were the people that like they're like, oh, what do you think? And I'm like, oh, I'm skeptical. They're like, yeah, but this could really be worth the 0 DTEs. I'm like, you know what? Like you're right. Again, this is where when we break that opening range, not that I think it's going to crack on the Kerrisdale, but just because the asymmetry is there, I don't think there's anything wrong with going into a little 0 DTE on that break of the opening range. But more importantly, I want to point out the break at around 11:15, because at this point we've now broken prior bar lows on the daily. More importantly, the stock's already cracking. We've got volume, we've got interest. So when we're unable to bounce at all and we consolidate so nice, those bars prior to the break at 1825 are just so beautifully consolidating. So I think on that break below 1825, that is the money shot, right? I can't predict and say that it's going to crack today. I'm a little skeptical because this thesis is already known, but once it's cracking, that's when the odds change. The best analogy I can give on this point is like, imagine if you start with 8 queen. 8 queen isn't that good of a hand, and I'm skeptical that 8 queen is going to be worth it and even worth playing. But then as you get more information, the odds change. And so what happens is once we break prior bar highs and we do this really tight setup into 1825, we've consolidated there. Now all of a sudden the odds are different. That's the equivalent of 9-10 jack coming out on the flop. What you were initially skeptical of as being a good hand, the information and the price action and the data changed, and now your odds are actually really good. Your expected value is amazing once that flop changes. This is really the best highlight of that concept I call just expected value dynamics, right? It's expected value is dynamic in the sense that every single bar that occurs, it's changing. And so once we break prior bar lows on the daily, once this sets up like it did, the expected value is so drastically different than what we assumed before. So that 1825 break, that is the money shot. That's where you short equity. That's where you go into the puts. And this works beautifully. Then at that point, the rest of the day we spend range bound. So I don't really touch any of that. But this trade is so important. Just to highlight the 0 DTE, to highlight the concept of how the odds can change. change. It's totally fine to be skeptical, but we need to listen to the price action and recognize how EV is changing over the course of that play. Now, the final trade I will discuss is CLSK, and this is an interesting one. This happened on 328 as well. So Alvin actually asked me some really good questions on this, and I'm going to try to address those because I think they were really great questions, really important. And so what happened in CLSK is this company filed an 8K at around 5:10 p.m. or so. This happened to be the day before Good Friday, which the markets are closed. And so while this happened on a Thursday after hours, this was the equivalent of a holiday after hours, where the next day there's no work. It's the equivalent of a Friday. Other thing that's interesting is this offering wasn't in a traditional offering filing. It wasn't in, a 425 or whatever. This was in an 8K. So Alvin asked me, why didn't this trade go initially? Like I shorted, but then it didn't go. How come? What do I do? So I explained to him two factors. This is after hours on essentially a holiday Friday. So the amount of people that are around are way, 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 way lower. It is released in a filing that most people aren't really paying as much attention to. For those reasons, sometimes this stuff can happen very, very slow over time. There's not a lot of people still at their computers that late on a holiday weekend. The more important part is I don't think there's anything wrong with going for this, and maybe you just give it to the unaffected price. Maybe we break that. It's kind of hard for me to tell. Once the volume does come in, people kind of wake up this. I don't think there's anything wrong with then if you got stopped out or if you just took your eyes off of it. There's nothing wrong with getting back in when the volume does come in, and that's when people are really waking up, and you can short and give prior bar highs. But I think I'm discussing this because it touches on an important note as far as this dissemination. It's so important in news trading world to think about the factors of dissemination. How broadly is the headline being seen? How trusted is the source? How big of a deal do people think it is? So there will be times where a headline might come out, but it's on a source that doesn't have a lot of eyes on it, or it's being done at a time where people aren't paying attention. Like AMC Ape, they snuck a couple filings in late on a Friday, and people weren't paying attention initially to those. And that stuff kind of happens where you need to think, okay, should this start moving? Why is it possibly not? It's kind of an added advanced skill set to recognize what are the reasons why something may be more slowly disseminated. Like, think back to the Ackman tweet on TLT a couple months back. Not everyone is paying attention to his Twitter, not every day trader, hedge fund manager, whatever, but that was something that was still going to eventually be disseminated. And so even though this was hidden there on kind of a holiday fake Friday, that's why this moved so slow, and that's what made this a little bit trickier. And those are some factors for you all to start thinking about to your game. So yeah, any questions on these, let me know, and thank you so much for the support.